Hi there, John Wilkinson again and History Made Easier again. This video is going to look at the way in which Germany managed the war, really the way Hitler managed the war. And I'm going to take an analytical approach that looks at the way in which Hitler managed his generals, the way in which the economy was managed, and the way in which Hitler managed himself, or maybe failed to manage himself. I think it's going to give you a really interesting approach to any question that considers the way in which the war was won and lost. Let's see how it goes. I'll begin with Hitler's management of his generals. After Hitler had asserted himself master of foreign policy at a meeting with his military commanders in November 1937, this was the meeting made known to us by the Hosbach Memorandum, Hitler then rid himself of those who had counselled caution. Baron von Neurath, his foreign minister, and von Blomberg, his minister of defence, and Colonel General Baron von Fritsch, spelt with a T, and that will be important soon, Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Neurath was quietly replaced as Foreign Minister by Ribbentrop, and there were examples of the old guard being got rid of quietly and with a degree of dignity. Sadly for von Blomberg and von Fritsch, spelt with a T, this was not to be the case for them. Von Blomberg became a victim of his own loneliness, a victim of the heart, though with a little help from the scheming of Göring and Himmler. He was a widower and wanted to remarry, but his choice had a past. He consulted with Göring over the matter, but Göring encouraged him to go ahead with the marriage. Hitler and Göring even attended as principal witnesses. But shortly afterwards, it was revealed that his blushing bride had a police record as a prostitute and as a woman who had posed for indecent photographs. That was the end of von Blomberg. As for von Fritsch, spelt with a T, Himmler and Göring produced a police report and a witness that both seemed to suggest that he had been guilty of homosexual practices, and so that was the end of von Fritsch, spelt with a T. He resigned. Only later was it found that the man in question was a retired cavalry officer called Frisch, spelt without a T. Something, of course, the Gestapo, Himmler and Göring had known all along. It led to von Fritsch's honour being restored, but not his position. Hitler then made himself Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He had, after all, already succeeded Hindenburg as Supreme Commander, and he abolished the Ministry of Defence, which by this time had already been renamed the Ministry of War, which itself was interesting. The Nazis then conducted a mini purge by retiring 16 senior generals, while 44 others were transferred to different commands, effectively demoted. And so we turn to Hitler's management of the war economy. Hitler's meeting with his military chiefs in November 1937 heralded a definite sea change in Hitler's leadership. He was now confident in power. He no longer needed the old elites. If they were not prepared to support him, without question, they could go. Another voice that had raised concerns, this time over the way in which the economy was imbalanced and overheating as a result of the push to rearm, was Schacht, the manager of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics. Schacht had already been moved aside when Göring took responsibility for the 4-year plan, but in December 1937 he was let go altogether, and to all intents and purposes he retired into private life. And if we look at how Nazi Germany managed its economy before the war, Hitler had always put a priority on rearming, though not at the cost of the consumer economy. A drastic drop in living standards for the prestige of a stronger military, few would have been seriously contemplating war, would simply not have been tolerated by the people. And though Hitler's rearmament program was impressive, German arms lacked depth. What Hitler had achieved was what is referred to as arming in breadth. That is, he had men and guns and enough bullets to begin with. He had artillery, tanks and armoured vehicles. He had bomber planes and fighter planes. He had battleships and cruisers. But he didn't have anything in reserve, and he didn't have stocks of munitions, nor, importantly, fuel. He hadn't rearmed in depth. This is where the strategy of blitzkrieg or lightning war came into play. A strong punch, a quick victory, and take over the economy of the defeated power, instigating a plunder economy. But it didn't work out that way. A key factor in explaining Germany's inability to conduct a major war, and so Germany's ultimate defeat, was the deceit of the man he trusted to oversee rearming, Hermann Göring, and the resulting gross inefficiency in the Nazi economy. By 1938, 52% of government expenditure and 17% of its gross national product was going to the military. By the summer of 1941, 60% of the workforce was engaged on military contracts, but much of that money, much of that effort was being wasted. Göring, responsible for overall control, coordinating the targets, the allocation of resources, and the spending of the different services, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, didn't do his job, so that the three services competed for capital and raw materials without regard to the needs of the overall strategy. They each set out to look after their own interests, and only their own interests. In fact, as Commander-in-Chief of the newly created Luftwaffe, Göring did his utmost to maximise resources to the Air Force. By 1941, a staggering 60% of the Army's expenditure went on administration, the result of fighting for resources and manpower, setting out their own case and also discrediting the claims of the other services. And in 1940, only 8% of the whole military budget went on the procurement of weapons. Alan Bullock writes of authoritarian anarchy and administrative chaos, and he quotes George Thomas, who became head of the economic staff in the War Ministry in 1939, before moving to become head of the War Economy and Rearmaments Office of the High Command of the German Armed Forces, and so an insider who would know what he was talking about. He wrote after the war, saying, "I can only repeat that in Hitler's so-called leadership state, there existed in economic affairs a complete absence of leadership and an indescribable duplication of effort and working at cross purposes. For Hitler shut his eyes to the need for fixed, long-range planning. Göring knew nothing of economics, and the responsible professionals had no executive powers." Also, both the Army and the Air Force preferred using small workshops with highly skilled workers and which could respond quickly to changes in design. They were against mass production and the standardization of parts. This led to the situation where, for example, the Junker 88 medium bomber had 4,000 different types of screw, which meant that it had to be assembled by hand rather than using automated machine tools. If factory production was used, they preferred short production runs so as to more easily incorporate the latest modifications. Consequently, Britain and the Soviet Union were able to outproduce Germany. Bullock quotes Richard Overy's book War and Economy in the Third Reich. In 1940, Germany spent an estimated $6 billion on weapons. Britain, $3.5 billion. Yet Britain produced over 50% more aircraft, 100% more vehicles, and almost as many tanks as Germany in 1940. If German armaments had been less well made and more efficiently produced and paid for, the number of weapons available in 1940 would have been considerably greater. Göring was quite simply the wrong man for the job. He set out to be second only to Hitler and would protect that position above all else. He monopolized decision-making. He appointed deputies that would not challenge him. He would suppress information that suggested mistakes had been made or that there were problems, or else he misrepresented data. The result was that he deliberately misled Hitler with regard to war production, deliberately hiding the extent to which rearmament was falling behind Hitler's targets. But this was the man that Hitler had put in control. Not until March 1940, when Fritz Todt was appointed as Minister for Weapons and Munitions, did things improve. Further helped when Albert Speer took over as Minister for Armament and War Production in February 1942. But by then it was already too late. Germany was well and truly bogged down in Russia. And so lastly I turn to Hitler managing himself, Hitler's management of himself. In 1940, with the Rhineland remilitarized and Schluss completed, the Sudetenland now part of the Reich, the rest of Czechoslovakia wiped off the map, and Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium and France defeated and occupied, the British licking their wounds across the Channel, Hitler was master of his own destiny, or so he thought. And all this had been achieved with his military chiefs and officer corps convinced to a man that at every turn he risked defeat at the hands of the British and the French. But in 1940 it went to his head. Hitler now saw himself not just as a political genius, but as a military genius too, on the same level as Moltke the Elder and Frederick the Great. But whereas as a strategist he had an imagination, audacity and courage in abundance, he didn't have experience. He didn't understand the logistics of moving armies around. Instead, he over-relied on willpower, and increasingly he came to rely only on himself, his own intuitions, his supreme will. He distrusted caution, objective analysis, constructive criticism. Consequently, from start to finish, the war was conducted through the war directives, his war directives. Bullock puts the total at 74 sent out by Hitler. From the general staff he required, and the general staff are the people who usually run armies, from the general staff he required only that they provided the technical support his decisions required. And when the German juggernaut was at last stopped at the gates of Moscow with the bitter Russian winter already in full swing, Hitler wouldn't allow even a tactical retreat. When his generals argued for or undertook tactical withdrawals, they were dismissed. Field Marshal von Bock was relieved of his command of Army Group Centre, ostensibly for health reasons. Field Marshal von Rundstedt of Army Group South, when he said he couldn't comply with the order to stand his ground. And Field Marshal von Lieb of Army Group North, who asked to be relieved of his command. General Guderian and General Hoppner were relieved of their command of panzer divisions. Hoppner was stripped of his rank and decorations, forbidden to wear his uniform, and denied his pension. When Field Marshal von Broschitz, Commander-in-Chief, offered his resignation, Hitler accepted it, taking over the role himself. General Halder remained in post as Army Chief of Staff until he argued with Hitler over the assault on Stalingrad. And though not part of the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, he would be sent to a concentration camp in the wake of that attempted plot. So, within weeks of being repulsed at the gates of Moscow, Hitler had rid himself of almost his entire high command and put himself in sole charge of the Reichswehr. From now on, there would be no more retreats. So we come to Stalingrad, the German debacle that Alan Bullock argues was the turning point in the war on the Eastern Front, and really, therefore, the war. A turning point that was reached as a result of a catalogue of disastrous misjudgment by Hitler, misjudgments made against all the advice of his professional soldiers. For at Stalingrad, Hitler lost all self-control, blaming the army for everything that went wrong. General Halder would later write, His decisions ceased to have anything in common with the principles of strategy and operations as they had been recognised for generations past. They were the products of a violent nature following its momentary impulses, a nature which acknowledged no bounds to possibility and which made its wish the father of its need. You and I might say he had lost the plot. The breakdown in relations between Hitler and the army was almost complete. There were a series of angry exchanges, denials, and forced resignations. When General Halder advised that the attack on Stalingrad be called off, he too was dismissed. Hitler said to him, "Half my nervous exhaustion is due to you. It is not worth it to go on. We need National Socialist ardour now, not professional ability. I cannot expect this of an officer of the old school like you." Halder's replacement, however, offered the same advice, but still the fighting went on. With von Paulus's 6th Army surrounded in January 1943, the Soviet commander called on von Paulus to surrender, but Hitler would not allow it. Germany would remember their sacrifice, he assured them, and to boost morale, he made von Paulus a field marshal. And when the field marshal, his army starved of ammunition, fuel and food, having simply lost the ability to continue fighting, did surrender, Hitler was furious. The man should have shot himself, just as the old commanders who threw themselves on their swords when they saw their cause was lost. And he swore that he had appointed his last field marshal. But that wouldn't matter. The war would drag on for more than a year, but it had already been lost. Hitler's management of himself finally interfered too much with his management of his generals. So if you're answering a question that asks you to consider the way resources were used, resources were managed, or whether indeed you're answering a question that asks you to consider why the war was won and lost, I think you've got a useful dimension there that will enable you to write an authoritative response, at least where it comes to dealing with Hitler and Germany. So I hope you are able to make good use of that. For now, though, I thank you for listening, and as always, I ask you to check out my History Made Easier website. But for now, cheers.